Welcome to Chapter 4, where we will be covering all of the relevant aspects of early childhood in as much detail as possible. As you can see, we're going to focus mostly on the cognitive and socio-emotional changes. We'll take a little step back from some of the neuroscience that we have been digging into deeply in previous chapters. And you can also see the general age range that we are involving here. This is not a hard and fast age limit, but generally it's starting after toddlerhood and continuing into the school or elementary age ranges. As will be a pattern moving forward for this and other aspects of childhood, instead of introducing a bunch of new things every lesson, we will be instead catching up with some of the things that have been developing that we've introduced before. So here we have the example of motor skills. You can also see that I've talked about some of these kinds of play. Now this isn't necessarily from our current textbook, but it has been used in the past, and I think it's a good idea to tie early childhood into a lot of what is happening, and a lot of their daily experience is involving various aspects of play. So here we see involving the gross motor skills, and of course this is large muscle group coordination such as arms, legs, and torso. They have learned to do these things earlier, but now they are becoming much more automatic and efficient. So for example, when running and jumping and combining aspects of these, there are a lot fewer accidents, a lot fewer falls, and we have the relation to this, what we call functional play. It's basically involving the basic functions of how to move around. And so anything that involves running around, such as in playgrounds or roughhousing, those kind of things, it is functional play. It is not really for any larger purpose in most cases. And we also talk about the aspect of automaticity. This means that when these things become automatic, then you have more short-term memory or working memory to be able to devote it less to not falling down and more to other things. So you can have multiple goals in mind at the same time where you're moving your body. We also see with fine motor skills the development of clearly artistic aspects, such as using whiteboards and crayons and markers. Also, keep in mind that this clearly involves use of the fine motor groups, such as with the fingers and fine motor movement, but it also involves the toes as well. So fine balance, such as standing on tippy toes, you can start to see more evidence of this in early childhood. We also see the relevant play is called constructive play. We are constructing something, we are working to create or build something with this aspect of fine motor skill development. We also see the development of handedness in early childhood. There may have been some hints before, but it tends to start to settle down at the beginning of early childhood. And we see the general percentage of 1 of 10 people being left-handed, and they might be more likely to be artistic or in some cases more intelligent, but since there's just generally a wider distribution around average involving people who are left-handed, they are also just as likely to be on more extreme ends of the lower end of the spectrum, and not just in terms of what we would consider gifted. We also see basically the progression, and again, we're going to catch up in the next chapter when we get to middle and late childhood, but we are here in Piaget's stage of the pre-operational stage, and we see a lot of representational ability, and this is what we talked about last lecture, involving pretend and imagining. So we see a lot of development and improvement and adding more levels of detail to schemas and symbolic understanding. So you walk into a room and you have to spend just less time trying to figure out what this room is, what I'm going to be expected to do, and you have that top-down processing that just, you have the expectations already set. You have a symbolic understanding of basically what to understand and what to expect. And like everything, having that top-down processing on the downside can cause us to make mistakes, but on the upside, it frees up working memory so we don't have to devote as much brain power to basic details and physical things, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, and we can then focus more on the higher level, what's my goal? What is my strategy for whatever task I'm going to have to navigate here? So while we're talking about the pre-operational stage, definitely want to talk about the symbolic functions. And this goes more to the aspect of this top-down, higher order processing that I've mentioned already. This is the idea that you can imagine, you can pretend, you can start to take other people's perspective. As we'll find out, children of this age are very egocentric, and we'll talk about specifically what that means. But they are starting to develop the idea of being able to put themselves into someone else's shoes, at least on a very surface level. And what this means is, in any social situation, it's not just what they want and what they want to do, but instead it's a negotiation between the people around you. And again, this is just the start. We're just seeing the start of this symbolic functioning, but it's clear evidence of progress from what came before in the very, very self-centered toddlerhood phase. Now we also have the play that corresponds to this. This is what we would call dramatic play. Just like acting out a drama, you are basically engaging in social scripts. So now you have an understanding of, if you play the role of a police officer, if you play the role of a chef, here's the kind of things you do and here's the kind of things you say. We also start to see this idea of intuitive thought. This is where we're starting to think about the reasons behind events happening. And again, toddlers, a lot of their world is just a bunch of stuff happening, and they have a very limited understanding of why it's happening and whether they can expect it to happen again or not. Now with this intuitive thought, again, a consequence of our higher reliance on top-down processing, we start to have an understanding of why something might happen and what if something changed. So you see these questions asked a lot more, and of course a 4-year-old might ask why and what if way too many times for the adults around to not get annoyed by, but it is a sign of progress in their trying to understand the world around them. We also see a reduction in this idea of animism. So by the end of early childhood, by ages 5 and 6, there's less of this idea that stuffed animals and toys actually have thoughts and feelings. So for example, ask a 3-year-old a question like this. So you're playing with a doll and you do something to the doll and they say the doll doesn't like it. Well, in their mind, that's their understanding. And then if you ask them, well, if she doesn't like it, why doesn't she say? Why don't you tell me? Why do you have to tell me? And then you just kind of get a blank stare, because that's one level of depth of processing and a limitation of taking someone else's perspective that early on in early childhood, the child just doesn't seem to have. So you'll see lots of examples of this being resolved toward the end of early childhood, in that children start to develop more concrete, and that's a link to the next stage in Piaget's development, concrete operational stage, a concrete understanding of what is real and what's not real in the world. Because to the 4 and 5-year-old, the line between what's real and not tends to be fairly blurred and unclear to them. We can also see the evolution of symbolic understanding in, for example, the art that they produce. So again, this could be some sort of constructive play. And if I didn't have these labels here of the 3.5 drawings for what features are what, I wouldn't know what this is. And I don't think most people would. And you see a lot of development of just key symbols or key features of something with very little regard for the background or the context. And of course, now we see something, fast forward to pre-adolescence, 11 years old. We see a clear example of what this image is, and then we see, for example, they might be thinking of Christmas because there are also perhaps presents by it. And so not only is their fine motor skills have developed a ton in the 8 years between these two ages, but also that corresponds with their symbolic understanding. So they can have a higher order understanding of what they want to produce, and they have the physical fine motor skills to be able to produce that. Continuing in Piaget's pre-operational stage, we have what I've previewed already, is the idea of egocentrism. And this is very simple because we see it in kids a lot, and I'm sure anybody who's dealt with young kids knows what an egocentric child is. Basically, they see the world from their perspective, and they can't comprehend that other people have different thoughts, different opinions, different preferences than they do. Now, there's some debate that, for example, as Americans, and we see this idea of cultural differences, Americans are just more egocentric in general, and that's the way we're socialized, especially compared to a relational culture like Japanese or the classic collectivist culture like China or Korea. And I think what we want to understand is that, sure, we can see some examples of what egocentrism looks like in adults, but it is a different form. It doesn't mean that if someone is more egocentric on average than another person, that they didn't resolve this properly as a child. I think to develop it and then for it to resolve itself in childhood is one thing, and then if it sort of comes back in a different form in adulthood, that's a different thing. Now also, we talked about the idea of focusing attention, and Piaget identified that and labeled it as this concept of centration. You can think about this as tunnel vision or focusing on one thing. And my example here is that 4-year-olds are bad at board games, which means that oftentimes they might just be focusing on which move can get them the furthest. They're focused on getting the furthest gets them the best results in general, so that's the only strategy. But of course, you have to count out which space you're going to land on, because if you go the furthest you can, sometimes you might end up on a bad space where something negative could happen. But that's factoring multiple things at one time that the pre-operational child just is generally not going to be very good at. So for example, then we also see thinking about two things. So if your idea is I want to go as fast as I can, and then you, for example, once you start going fast, then you have to pay attention to objects in your way. Well, that's one extra thing to pay attention to. Chances are there's going to be a fall or an accident. We also have the example of irreversibility. This relates to also the idea of animism that we talked about in the previous slide. For example, let's say the teddy bear gets opened up and some of the stuffing's coming out. For the child in the pre-operational stage, they might believe that now that my bear has changed in a way that's bad, it can't be undone. So now the world is a very sad place because of my teddy bear, and it's been changed and it's been injured, and maybe I even think it has feelings about this. Whereas, of course, for the adult, we understand that some things are irreversible. Once you break an egg, for example, you can't put it back together. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, the proverbial phrase. But many things, on the other hand, are irreversible. And as we'll talk about with the conservation of mass and matter, changing the form of something does not mean that you can't change it back in many cases. And of course, by the end of early childhood, children will start getting these questions of basic logic correct. Whereas a couple years before, they will be very traumatized at something that adults would view as reversible. So I'll run through a couple examples of some of these concepts. Here we see an example of egocentrism, the idea that whatever opinion or preference a child has, they assume everybody else has it. And if somebody says something different, that's not just an opportunity for a teachable moment or a discussion. It is, for example, a way to see somebody as fundamentally different, for example, for somebody who's egocentric. We also see some egocentrism in conversation. And this is one of my favorite things about the pre-operational stage, is that if you were watching these children have this conversation, either across the room or through mirrored glass perhaps, it would look like they are having a real meaningful interaction. We watch their body language, we watch them take turns in talking, and it would look like they are having a meaningful conversation. But of course, if we listen to the content, we see that they are not meeting in any meaningful way. One is thinking about one thing, one is thinking about the other, and there's no in between. So what this goes to show is, again, an example of dramatic play. They seem to, in some cases, show an interest in running through these social scripts and expectations before they have the full top-down understanding of what it is like to meaningfully participate in these kinds of things. Here we have the classic conservation of mass problem, and basically This is the classic run through is you make sure they're looking here, ask which has more, A or B, and then they say they're the same. Then you make sure they're watching while you pour B into C, and then ask them, does A have more, C have more, or are they the same? Now, this is one example of a specific example of centration because they are focused specifically on the taller object as having more of whatever's in it. And what's really funny is you can have very rich language environments that some children are raised in, and maybe they'll be reading middle school books for a 4-year-old, and they'll have very good language to discuss this problem, but language development is very receptive to the richness of the environment around. On the other hand, things like spatial processing and this conservation of mass problem, that child who looks very verbally intelligent will still suffer for this problem. Now, of course, once you get toward the end of early childhood, you get to age 6 or so, they'll start getting this problem correct in a way that they weren't before. It just goes to show that some aspects of pre-intelligence are a little bit more regimented in terms of exactly the age range and when they start to form. This is another example of the conservation of mass issue. Of course, whether you get 2 small slices or 1 big slice, it's the same amount. There's only 1 pizza, but that's not the way a 4-year-old is processing. They think just to have more, a larger number is to have more, a greater amount. And of course, give it a few years and they'll start to see the logic that they are missing a couple years before. Here we see an example of centration. The idea is to determine which way this scale is going to tip. Of course, if we're trying to address this problem as adults, we're going to be looking at multiple factors. How far away from the middle are the objects? Are the objects made of the same thing? But children who are 4 or 5 years old are mostly going to say it's going to turn to the left because that side has the bigger object. And instead of considering multiple factors, they're centered on just that one aspect, the bigger one, and that's what's going to drive their answer to the question. This is one of my favorite slides because it illustrates both the concepts of egocentrism and centration. So of course, Calvin is egocentric, so he just cares about the coins that are his. He doesn't care about anything that's not his. That doesn't concern him, right? All that matters is which ones are his. Now, there's also the idea of centration, because this can be a basic how much money do I have problem, but of course for the dad, it's a larger issue of can I teach a lesson? But of course, Calvin is only centered and has tunnel vision for this one aspect, and he can't take the perspective of his dad's. So the egocentrism means that he can't take any other perspective, and the centration is that he can only focus on the one that's his. This one always entertains me too, because if you just listen to when kids start to go to preschool or kindergarten perhaps, they think about things that we have just had drilled into our heads as adults, that there's one right answer and one right way to do it. But this will also illustrate something about learning language, is that first you learn by repetition. You hear other people talk, and again, running through this scripts without the higher level understanding of the deeper meaning. Then you learn that there are rules. And then finally you learn that there are exceptions to the rule. And I definitely saw this with my own kid, because he would say 22 as 2 and it sounds weird to us, but with most of the double numbers, we actually take the number and then add the second number to it. So for example, 7, 77, 87, 97. We just take the number, add a t, and there we go. So why is 50 not 5d? Why is 20 not 2d? Well, we don't have a good reason. I guess I could probably do an internet deep dive to try and figure it out. But we know it's wrong. It's 22, and that's the right answer, even though the logic that got there we don't understand. And so I think it's those illustrations where we really see how the child is unbound in the preoperational stage by a lot of the strictures that we have that are a direct result of the acculturation that we have gone through to get there. Let's leave Piaget for a while, but stick within the cognitive realm. So, for example, we have this idea of attention to relevance. They are starting to be able to center and focus their attention a little bit. And then by the end of early childhood, not only are they being able to focus their attention, but they can also focus their attention on things that aren't the most flashy or the most loud. Because you take your average 3 or 4 year old, you can get them started on doing some basic problems or a puzzle, and then the dog barks or there's a siren outside or a big noise on the TV. Their attention then is directed at those other things and not on the central problem. And of course, we can see a lot of adult examples. For example, magic, the pre-operational child will probably believe that magic exists. Harry Potter really can conduct spells. We see a lot of with politics and dating. Are you focused on the most obvious things such as attractiveness, or do you focus on more substantial things? And we see a gradual development of being able to pay attention to relevance and substance rather than just the loudness. We also see a development of self-control. I know I've introduced a lot of concepts involving the self. This would be part of the greater self-regulation web that we've been talking about. The classic one is delay of gratification. And the idea is you pass up an immediate reward for something that's going to be a bigger reward later on. And the marshmallow test is a classic example. It's been doing research. Researchers have been doing research on it for decades. And the idea is put a kid in a boring small room, put a marshmallow in front of them, and then say, well, you can have that marshmallow, or if it's still there when I come back in 3 minutes, you can have 2 more marshmallows. And obviously some kids are just going to eat the marshmallow. That's what they want. No delay of gratification. Some will be obsessed with the marshmallow, but not exactly eat it. They'll lick it, they'll nibble on it, they'll push it around. And other examples showing full delay of gratification, children will sing songs to themselves, they'll distract themselves so that when the researcher comes back in, then they get those extra marshmallows. What's really interesting though is if you do longitudinal research, we tend to see that the development of delay of gratification, the individual difference, and again, kids have a large range of delay of gratification that they show. But if kids start to show that in early childhood, it tends to be sort of solidified in that later on they are more likely to show delay of gratification for more high stakes examples, such as they go from higher levels of education, they are more likely to be at a higher level in terms of employment and job rank, and of course in terms of managing your finances. We all have tons of things that we would just like to buy right now, but with the idea that we need to save money as well, we don't just empty our wallets every day. Hopefully, at least successful adults aren't likely to do that. We also see the brain component, and this is the prefrontal cortex. So we start to see some heavy myelination. Now, it's not necessarily finished off in early childhood, but we see maybe a little progress in childhood, and then that myelination rate ramps up in the prefrontal cortex in early childhood, which then will finalize in the next stage, middle to late childhood. So again, being able to focus your attention, being able to focus what you are trying to do is definitely going to have the brain or neural correlate of the prefrontal cortex activation. So we'll keep that in mind for the future as well. Attention to detail is something that, as we probably know, 4 and 5-year-olds don't have a ton of. So you show them some similar objects and ask if they're the same. Well, they have the same basic shape, they have the same basic number of windows, same roof. Yeah, they're the same. Of course, if we take a closer look, we see a lot of differences. And that takes an ability that our brain has had to develop that the 4 or 5-year-old just won't have had enough reps to get these kind of problems right very often. Small differences will just not be noticed. It'll go right over their head. And to place some of the concepts we've talked about into this general web of self-regulation, we're going to have a lot of abilities, especially that we'll talk about separating themselves out and solidifying in middle to late childhood. And we can start talking about intelligence and breakdowns of different kinds of intelligence then. But for now, we're not talking about intelligence such as verbal and spatial intelligence that's in it. For example, if a 4-year-old has high verbal intelligence, does that mean that they're going to be a highly verbal adult? Well, it's predictive, but it still could change, right? But outside of this ability, we have the self-regulation. So even if someone doesn't later on develop high ability or intelligence with verbal, spatial, math, those kinds of things, they still can show evidence of self-regulation. And it goes the opposite as well. You can have children who are very smart but can't self-regulate. So for example, they are very capable of getting a lot of math problems right, but they may make those stupid mistakes that if they just take a second and step back and monitor and ask them some questions, they'd be able to not make those mistakes and get the problems right, even though they have the ability. And of course, self-directed time management, some kids start to show the ability to really want to use their time and be productive, even starting at this age range. And others, if you just let them play video games or watch TV all day, that's what they'll do. We'll also talk about the idea of metacognition coming up in Chapter 5. But the idea is you're taking a step back and thinking about the strategies you're using, similar to the idea of self-monitoring, and learning from ways in which you may have messed up. And again, this is less ability-based and more about the controlling yourself. And of course, we already talked about emotional regulation should start to develop even in toddlerhood, before early childhood. And of course, we still need to see some improvement of that in early childhood as well. But all of these things are wrapped up in the general concept of self-regulation. Let's take a look at what's happening in terms of memory. So we're still in the cognitive realm of development. And we see at this age range, it starts to reach kind of mature or adult levels by the end of early childhood, and greater plus or minus 2 around the average of 7. 7 chunks, 7 things, 7 items that you can keep in your short-term memory. We also see a lot of development of long-term memory. As we talked about before early childhood, the hippocampal circuit is not really formed, and so the brain doesn't have the ability to really encode things in an adult long-term way very well. Now that circuit is engaged, but it's not quite at adult levels yet. And we see that it is highly dependent on cues or context. So for example, if you ask a preschooler, what did you do in preschool today? Chances are you won't get a lot in terms of an answer. But if you push them specifically, asking leading questions, did you go to gym? Did you have a snack? Did you talk to this person? Then you start to see evidence that yes, they did encode some long-term memories, but they aren't able to access it just by themselves without the right cues or the context. Now we also see the development of the theory of mind. So as egocentrism starts to be reduced by the end of early childhood, not gone, but reduced, that is counterbalanced by the increase in this idea of theory of mind. So for example, not only can you think about your own thoughts and feelings, can you think about other people's, and what other people have thinking about other people's thoughts and feelings. And of course, as adults, we're used to thinking this way, just watching TV and thinking what characters are thinking about each other. but kids in early childhood they don't have that very effective brain power yet. And so we see the basic development, right? At 3 years, they're able to look at a face and gauge why Tommy or Susie is happy or sad, but they don't know why. Once we get to 5 years and toward the end of the pre-operational stage, they can also say the why. So Tommy is sad because Susie stole his toy. And of course, you can have gray areas where I'm wrong and mommy is right, or we're both right in some way and we're both wrong in some way. But that's not the kind of depth of thinking that we see for your average 4 or 5-year-old. Also, the classic why kids are bad liars. To be able to tell a plausible liar means you have to be able to understand your audience's thinking well enough to know what they would consider to be plausible. And if you can't take their perspective, if you ask a 4-year-old, how did the lamp get broken, they can come up with all sorts of stuff that makes sense to them, but of course wouldn't make sense to the parent or an adult. So they'd say the tooth fairy had the wrong address and knocked over the lamp and then was sad and left. So that's just kind of the magical thinking and the unclear disconnect between reality and pretend that your pre-operational child is just going to show. Here we see a classic test of your short-term memory. And again, for most people, once we start to get past 7, plus or minus 1 or 2, some people start to make mistakes with fewer than 7. Pretty much everyone's going to start to make mistakes once we get above 8 or 9. Now, here's where we also see some evidence of maybe pre-intelligence, and especially those who will be ultimately gifted and genius level, because at early ages they will show very mature levels of digit span. So maybe they could remember 20 random numbers in sequence. And for those who are genius, maybe they can remember it backwards if you ask them, which is something that most people will never experience that kind of processing power in their brain. But it's interesting that this is obviously a very simple test, costs no money to develop or administer, but if you see a kid, and even starting at early childhood, that shows a very effective and above average working memory, then that's probably a kid that will predict good things for later on. It's no guarantee, but it's a nice to have, that's for sure. Let's talk a little bit about language development. So first of all, we have the distinction between the morphology and the meaning of a word, which is where adults mostly focus, and the phonology, which is the sound. And so, of course, Dr. Seuss, a lot of use of rhythm and rhymes. A lot of it doesn't make sense. A lot of the words in Dr. Seuss aren't actual words. They're just made up. And it sounds a little bit like gibberish to adults, but even adults can enjoy the phonology. But children especially are going to be driven by the phonology. So things like rhymes and puns and rhythm in language are what are going to catch the children's attention more than deeper meaning. And what's also important to remember is that language is intrinsically interesting to early childhood. They are seeking out and have their radar up for new and novel things. And so even though parents are going to be using many words that the children won't understand, it is a good idea to use them, because then it will cause them to ask questions. What does this mean? Why did you choose this word when another word can work? And that can lead to some very useful discussions later. We also have the idea of language pragmatics. So if someone is a pragmatic person, they are a very rational, logic-based, don't get in trouble. And the same applies to the pragmatics of language. This is where you learn that there are some places or contexts or audiences where you can swear and others where you can't, because you'll get in trouble. And it's important to remember that, again, it's a human universal that we know for adults, well, children and adults, to learn a spoken language, but it is not a human universal to learn it in written form. And so we can't just assume that, for example, with email or any written communication, that the pragmatics that we have learned for spoken language will automatically apply. And I'm sure we've all gotten in trouble online in one way or another because our spoken language pragmatics may not have carried over to our written pragmatics. And again, those are all teachable moments, and especially for children, when they make mistakes that adults would identify as incorrect usage, an adult needs to be there to correct that behavior, and so learning can take place to develop these pragmatics. They won't happen by themselves. Now we also have, regarding the development of language, a little bit of a nerd fight, and to be honest, there's evidence for both of these perspectives. Now, as I talked about before, it seems like language is a little bit more nurture than nature. We have our nature program to learn a spoken language, no doubt. And we could think about the language acquisition device or other genes that program us to seek out a language and learn it. But also what language that's going to be, what pragmatics, the level of our vocabulary, that's all nurture. That's all the things that we're exposed to in our environment, in the schools and at home and with caretakers. And so clearly we see lots of evidence that highly elaborative parents lead to much higher level verbal abilities. Now the issue is, if we really pay attention, how is it happening? Piaget thought from a top-down process, you have the thought, the symbolic understanding, the schema of that thing you were talking about. And once you understand it in your head, then you produce the language to reflect that. So for example, this kind of explains humor and sarcasm in that kids will tell jokes that they hear other people laughing at without understanding what's funny about it. They'll also, for example, drop something and then say, "Oh, great," at sarcasm, even though they don't understand what sarcasm is. So this kind of goes opposite of what Piaget was saying. Again, the thought first, then you express it. This is, you basically copy it first, and then you understand what sarcasm is later, even though you've been using sarcasm for a couple years. And I think, so again, you can find examples for where Piaget was correct, but you can also find counterexamples which don't apply to this. And one of the classic examples is private speech or self-talk. So if you think about going about your day, do you have an inner monologue? Can you hear your own voice in your head? And sometimes, do we express it out loud? Are we self-talking to ourselves? I know I do it. And I have to learn the pragmatics that maybe it's okay to do it by myself, but it's not okay to do it when I'm in the company of others, especially in a quiet place. Keep my thoughts and my talking to myself. But we also see the private speech of those in early childhood. That is a normal factor. And what that means is, if you have a 4-year-old and they're playing, and maybe they don't know you're in the room or nearby, they're probably not paying attention to you. So yeah, you can be across the room, and they'll probably start talking to themselves, and not necessarily running through like a play dialogue, but just kind of random thoughts or things that are relevant to what they're playing with. And basically, that's the idea, is that's normal. And I think part of the transition from understanding and learning the basics of language to being able to speak it very effectively in a couple years is that middle ground where they have to, for a low stakes in terms of maybe practice, work through it themselves. And then of course we go sort of opposite from Piaget. We talk about Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development. So again, this is the help that children need to learn. And of course, with language, I would say many children have the opportunity to be effective speakers of language. But the problem is that that zone seems to be a little bit more rigid for things like math. So for example, well, you can only start doing certain kinds of math problems at certain ages. And even if they're verbally advanced, chances are the math is not in lockstep with that. And so we have the idea of, now we're in early childhood thinking, or even entering schools or kids into the educational school system. And we have what's known as IEPs, individualized ed plans, with the idea that the help or the scaffolds that one child needs can be quite different from other children. There's also this idea of response to intervention. This, my understanding is, I'm not an educator, so I haven't been totally involved in the theory behind this, but the idea that what works for some children don't work for other children, but each child has something that will work for them, and the teacher has to have multiple tools in the toolbox, so to speak, so that if one intervention doesn't work, no response, then you have to try another intervention to see if there is a positive response. And I think the Vygotsky idea of individualizing things, at least in a way that's practically manageable, has been a good thing. Here's a classic example in cognitive psychology known as the WUG test. Probably never heard of the term WUG, and that's very intentional. You have kids exposed to things that they've never seen before. They don't have a symbolic understanding of a WUG, and then ask them to do some basic language things involving it. So for example, this is a WUG. Now I have two. I have two, and most children will say WUGs. What this shows is that they came to that answer not because they're simply copying somebody else who has said WUGs. They're doing that because they have learned a rule and they learn how to apply the rule. Now, what this means is that we have this very interesting phenomena known as over-regularization with language. Over-regularization means basically, here's the sequence. First, children are largely copying what they hear adults say in terms of language development. Then comes the application of rules, and what we see is over-regularization is the over-application of rules. So for example, take a simple word such as walk. Okay, I walked to the store, now I'm back from the store, I walked from the store. And the rule is you take the verb, add ed to it, and then that's the right answer. Now, of course, some verbs are not regular, and instead of saying hitted in past tense of hit is the same as the present tense hit. And what you see is that kids will first start getting this right. Buddy hit me. And then, maybe half a year later, they'll start to get it wrong. And from a parent's perspective, that's very interesting because it seems like they're backsliding. But what we find is that first they were just copying what they've heard other people say. Then they learn that there's a rule to add ed for a past tense of a verb. And then they have to learn that there are exceptions to the rule. And here's where, if I spoke another language as my primary language and had to learn English, I would probably be very frustrated. And I know some other people that I spend a lot of time with who English is not their first language. They get very frustrated by these exceptions to the basic rules of English that are all over the English language. So now we're talking about with scaffolding and with the richness of the language environment, what's happening? What are the adults in the child's life doing? And we can tie this to parenting styles. So this might be a review for some of you, but here are the basic four. And the first two on this slide are the classic authoritarian. And again, this is sort of the old school model. And if we think about authoritarian leaders for other countries, basically they get to decide what happens, and they rule through threats and punishment. And if you do something I like, you get rewarded. If you do something I don't like, you get punished. There's no larger thought about the greater good or internalizing of values. And so, as we see, it is a very effective way in that it does cause changes in behavior. But it is very limited in that it only basically uses one aspect of behavior change, and again, rewards and punishments, and it doesn't really involve much higher order thought. So there aren't any larger lessons. There's no complex discussion of morals or values. And of course, if we see the classic parent-child interaction, you are talking and speaking from a position of authority. And in some ways, you might combine anger with it, and you can also be modeling anger so that children from authoritarian parents are more likely to not only learn not to do that one thing that got them in trouble, but also when they get mad as adults, then it is appropriate, because their parents did it, to get mad at other people. Now, the gold standard here is the authoritative. We've talked about the limits of the authoritarian. You still take some of that because you set rules and have rewards and punishments, but you also have the discussion. And so, for example, if a child is having a temper tantrum, sure, you got to take them out of the situation, maybe punish them a little bit because they can't just keep doing what they were doing. But once they've calmed down, then you get down to their level, face to face, as equals, as partners in the relationship, so to speak. And you talk about things such as working through the thought process behind whether what you did was a smart thing to do or not smart, whether it was moral or ethical. And that's when we see children internalizing the larger values and morals of their parents. So they not only want to be good to get stuff, they want to be good because it reflects their internalized values and feels good to be good. We also have the permissive parents. These are parents who, like Homer Simpson, they do love their kids, there's no doubt about that, but they don't put in the hard work of correcting them. And so, of course, you have children who can, when raised by permissive parents, look to be a little wild and uncontrolled. And of course, if the parents aren't teaching their kids what gets them in trouble, for example, language pragmatics, well, if they're swearing up a storm in school, somebody else is going to do the work for them. And so they will learn life lessons and rewards and punishments, but they'll learn it later and in more high-stakes situations than if the parents had just taught them themselves. And then finally, we have the uninvolved parenting, disengaged. It's not clear whether there's a whole lot of love, and I used to think of uninvolved as sort of the terrible parents that you'd see on crime shows, but I think now we're seeing, especially with technology, it is just easy to be in the same room as other people and focused on your podcast or your TV or your game or whatever. And so you are certainly providing a healthy environment, a safe environment, but not doing the hard work of the one-on-one, face-to-face interaction that kids this age really benefit more from than anything on a screen. We can also introduce the idea of aggression, and we can start to see evidence of different kinds of aggression. So for example, instrumental aggression, it's using your body as an instrument, pushing people out of the way, fighting, and we don't necessarily think about this as a desirable milestone, but it actually is something, especially with individualist cultures like the United States, where you do want to see. Because going back to Erikson's development of the psychosocial stages, the development of the self is first to identify what you want, and then learn that you can act as an instrument in your life to get things that you want. So again, terrible twos is a good thing to see. They're demanding things out of their environment, but it's also important that you have adults there to correct when instrumental aggression is wrong. So you can have playtime where it's okay to wrestle and maybe hit a little bit, but when it's not playtime, then you have to make sure the instrumental aggression stops. Also, we see evidence of relational aggression, and this is where instead of using physical force, you are using relational force, making threats, calling people names, excluding them from things, and of course attacking people's reputation and making them feel bad. Now generally we see boys doing more instrumental aggression and girls doing more on average relational aggression. I don't think that's necessarily down to much genetics. It's probably a lot of social expectations, and of course both genders are going to do some level of both of these. And I think instrumental aggression, where somebody goes to the hospital, of course everyone's going to notice that and talk about it. Relational aggression can be just as damaging, but much less flashy. And so, of course, parents and educators should be just as receptive to correcting out of bounds relational aggression as they are to instrumental aggression that's undesirable. And as we start to wrap up, let's start to talk about what the educational environments look like for successful students. Because again, we're starting the preschool, possibly, era. Hopefully all kids are going to preschool, but some parents resist, or some parents don't have the resources to be able to invest in preschool. But also we talk about kindergarten. And the best example seems to be what involves child-centered kindergarten. And again, child-centered, instead of just focusing on here's the material, they're going to have to learn how to learn it themselves this one way. Child-centered is again more individualized. And so, for example, we see evidence of China. So, for example, China, you can get into a good school, and maybe you have to be separated from your parents for large parts of your childhood, and it's their way or the highway. If you're not good enough, you are not welcome in that school anymore. And what it does is offer a lot of control and deference to authority. And unlike child-centered kindergarten, however, it is not the old school model that fosters creativity. So the United States seems to do a good job of fostering a lot of creativity and innovation in childhood that then seems to apply later on to entrepreneurship and the business sector. Now, one specific example of what kind of looks like child-centered kindergarten is this idea of Montessori. Marcia Montessori had some good teaching techniques and then a whole lot of extra theory that probably isn't supported by a lot of today's research. The idea is, though, is that it takes a great teacher. Teacher has to be very attentive. The teacher is facilitating rather than just doing direct instruction. So you have, for the Montessori approach, children who have good self-esteem. They have been trained to lead and take charge of situations more than your average child. But of course, there may be some downsides. So there's the idea of the trophy generation, that everybody needs to feel special just because they participated. You can also apply this to the idea of the snowflake without the political stuff piled on top of it. And again, do only children, maybe they get more attention at home, so maybe this helps them less. I think the idea, though, is that part of what makes Montessori work is that they just have larger or smaller class sizes. And child-centered kindergarten sounds great, but once you have 30 students in a classroom, you can't give the individualized attention that they probably, in a perfect world, would get. Here you can see a child-centered classroom, and instead of just having a bunch of desks facing the front, you see it instead it's organized into a lot of different workstations. And so you have toys where you can work on fine motor skills, constructive play in the art area. Probably you would have small groups and rotating groups around the classroom, and the teacher can at some point intervene when necessary, but also let the groups be a little bit self-guided at other times and manage and regulate their own behavior. So another way to think about the child-centered approach is to have multiple ways to represent material, multiple ways to engage, and of course now we're incorporating videos and computers at younger and younger ages that we didn't do before, and multiple means of expression and action. So of course you're going to compliment a student when they raise their hand and everybody sees that, but you're also going to compliment a student when they show sympathy or empathy for someone who has feelings hurt. And that's something that maybe doesn't draw as much attention, but a good child-centered teacher will notice all those things as well. We also see a lot of development of group work, small group activities, and maybe they can even come up with their own rules and standards for what is good and bad performance. So a lot of self-directed, with supported by the teacher when necessary, and individualized goal setting in the child-centered approach. And as we wrap things up, again, the idea is with a small enough class size and a motivated enough teacher, an enabled teacher, we don't beat our students starting at this early age into the ground and take away their individuality and let them just accept whatever the teacher is going to do. They have some say in the kinds of things that the class does. They have some say in the kind of goals that are being set for them. And I think that's important at any level of education, of course, and certainly we don't want to lose this at an earlier and earlier age. And I think the US generally does a pretty good job of this, and I think it's up to taxpayers and the administration to enable teachers to be able to do this, because I think most of them in a perfect world would be teaching this way. All right, thanks for hanging in there. Hopefully we'll have a lot of stuff to discuss in the discussions.